Hello, my name is Barbara Levin. I'm the Executive Director of Neurofibromatosis Mid-Atlantic. We are a 35-year-old nonprofit agency devoted to NF support, awareness, and education. Neurofibromatosis is a variable and potentially devastating genetic disorder that causes tumors to grow anywhere on the body. It is often misdiagnosed, and scientific studies show that the most common form of NF occurs in 1 in every 2,500 births. This statistic is much quoted, but it must be noted that, given the caveat that if NF were correctly diagnosed, the number could escalate to 1 in every 1,000 births for the most common form of NF. Neurofibromatosis has over 500 manifestations, and research suggests that 8 to 10% of NF tumors are malignant. Early death is not foreign to people with NF and those who love them. Death and grieving touches every family, whether they have NF or not. Like NF, the reaction to loss is variable and often not discussed. At NF Mid-Atlantic, we felt we needed to enter the conversation and help people move towards coping. Before we begin, I wanted to take care of some housekeeping items. There is a question pane on the right side of your screen. If you have questions during the live presentation, simply type in your question and click Send. At the end of the presentation, we will do a question and answer session and take as many questions as time permits. I will be muting everyone while Dr. Bowman speaks, but feel free to write your questions. This broadcast is being recorded, and I will send a link to you of the entire presentation as you are subscribed to the series. Feel free to share it with your family and loved ones. We ask that additional copies be accompanied with a donation to allow us to continue presenting these webinars. Please remember that you are welcome to return for part 2 of this series on coping with grief, when an incurable disorder affects daily living. If you haven't registered for this as yet, you may do so. I now want to welcome Dr. Mary Ann Sontag Bowman. Dr. Bowman is Associate Professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Montana at Missoula, and has devoted her adult life to the area of bereavement, grief, and ultimately hope. She has helped so many with her deep understanding of the grief process, and we are so honored that she is joining us today. Dr. Bowman.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope that it will be useful. So what I'm going to do today is talk about grief, coping with grief, and I personally think that one of the most important ways to cope with grief is to understand what is normal. It seems like if we know what to expect and what is normal, we can handle it a lot better. So I like this quote. I truly thought I was losing my mind, and then I thought, great, first I lose my mom, and now there goes my mind. I think that's really typical for people that are grieving, that they don't understand what is normal, and so it adds to the burden when they have all the experiences that are really common and typical with grief. So today we're going to focus a lot on what is normal and what to expect from grief. And then tomorrow we'll talk more specifically about coping with grief, especially as it relates to a devastating diagnosis. So like Barbara said, if you have questions, please just type them in if you're listening to this live, and I'm happy to answer those. So grief, when we talk about grief, and most people understand pretty much what we mean when we're talking about grief. It's a reaction to a loss. But I think what people don't always understand is that it can be a reaction to any loss. It doesn't have to be death. It's the loss of something that we value, something that we are attached to. So grief is always related to attachment. We only experience grief for things that matter. So if you think about in your life the things that matter to you, you realize that the nature of the attachment you have to those things will determine how you feel if those things were gone. So for instance, if you lose your favorite pencil, that's not going to be such a, you're probably not going to have a big grief reaction to that. If you lose someone you love or health, that certainly is, you're going to have a way different grief reaction than if you lose your favorite pencil. So we only experience grief for things that matter to us, and I always like to remind people that we're not in charge of telling other people what should matter and what shouldn't matter, or what they should be attached to, what they shouldn't be attached to. People get to decide that for themselves. Sometimes I worry that we think, oh, well, that's not grief-worthy. Well, that's not our job. Our job is to be understanding and supportive of whatever another person decides matters to them. So really important to understand that grief is a normal reaction to loss of all types, and something is really only a loss if we're attached to it. We can't, if we lose something that doesn't matter to us, it's not really that big of a loss. So that's really important as we begin our conversation excuse me, about normal grief. So many of us have heard theories and explanations about grief, and I know this because I worked at a children's hospital, and I would have these parents that I was working with who had lost children come to me and say, oh my gosh, I'm not grieving, I need help, I'm not doing this right. I was in the anger stage and now I'm back in the anger stage. So clearly I'm not doing my grief work correctly. And I just think that's so unfortunate that people think that. But the truth is that that's out there. So let's just say it. We've got Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's groundbreaking work from 1969 on death and dying, super important part of starting the conversation about terminal care and grief in the United States and other places. And what she did was she researched and came up with these 5 stages. And she actually researched with dying people, not necessarily bereaved people. She came up with that grief can be talked about in terms of 5 stages. That first you're in denial, then you're angry, you go through a bargaining stage, depression, and then eventually you get to acceptance. I really like the work of J. William Morden, and he's written a great book on grief counseling and multiple editions, most recent one 2008. And he talks about not so much stages but tasks of mourning, that the things that need to happen before you get to a better place with grief, I guess is the way to say it. He talks about how you have to accept the reality of the loss, work through the pain of grief, and adjust to a changed environment or a world that doesn't include the one or the thing that is lost, and then emotionally relocating the deceased and moving on with life. So in other words, finding a place for the grief or the person who is gone or whatever it is that's gone, and going on. So these are I think 2 really big ones. There's other theories and explanations about grief, but most people especially know the Kubler-Ross stages. And in fact, professionals will tell people, when they've had something happen, okay, you're going to go through these stages and, don't be concerned, this is what's going to happen. And I used to be one of those people that would say that to people until I worked with so many grieving people, and I realized, wait a minute, their grief experience actually doesn't match what I had read about as an academic person. The real life grief experiences of people wasn't neat and tidy like that. And it took me a while of working every day with grieving people, and I came up with the idea that actually grief is not linear and it's not orderly. So when you talk about stages, you're talking about some kind of orderly progression, as if you're going through something and you're arriving at some end acceptance. I had a mom who lost a school-age girl to cancer, and she said to me, I'll never forget this, she said, I will never accept the death of my daughter. It's not acceptable. And I was really struck by that she's right. It is not acceptable, the things that people have to endure. So it's sort of silly to tell them, well, you'll get to a stage of acceptance. No, probably not. So grief is not linear and it's not orderly, and telling people that it's going to be just sets them up to fail. And when you're already dealing with something really hard, or you wouldn't be grieving, you don't also need the burden of thinking you're doing it wrong. Grief is hard enough as it is. You shouldn't have to also think, oh great, I fail. I fail at grief. I'm not good at this grief stuff. So in my thought, what people's experience suggested to me is that instead of being linear and organized and orderly, grief is really chaos. I mean, I think that's the best way I can put it. It's not, there's nothing neat about it, and it's a big mess. It's a mess in every part of who you are. And the job of grief is not to progress through all these orderly stages in some neat way, but the job of grief is really just to reorder that chaos and find a new normal. And everybody's going to do that differently. And there's not one way to go through it. So when I started thinking of it like that, and again, I started thinking of it like that because that is indeed what it looked like as I was working with grieving people. And it didn't look like what I had read in the books. This is what it looked like, a big mess. Well, then I started thinking of it like that. I think it's important to know that, so that people, when they feel like one big giant mess, won't think, oh great, I'm a mess. Well, yes, but that's normal, and you're going to be okay again. It's normal that you feel that way. So, like I said, I'm a big fan of, if you know what's normal, you can get through a lot of things. So that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about, well, what does normal grief look like? It looks like chaos. Okay, well, let's talk about that even more. Let's break it down. What are the manifestations of normal grief? Most people sort of imagine that, well, grief is like you're sobbing all the time, you're hysterical, you're sad. Well, that's just one part of grief. When you've had a big loss, there is not a part of you that's not affected by grief. And so it's bigger than just the emotional. Grief has physical implications, emotional, social, cognitive, and spiritual. And I want to talk about each one in turn and just the manifestations of that particular category that I have seen the most prevalent. That doesn't mean that everybody who's grieving is going to experience those things. Doesn't mean that there's anything wrong if a person is experiencing different ones or none of them. It's just, they're just common. So let's talk about them. So the first one is physical manifestations of grief. And really, really common are changes in appetite. And it usually goes the direction you wish it wouldn't. Like, if you really wish you could gain weight, suddenly you don't want to eat. And if you really would love to lose some weight, suddenly you're really hungry and eating all the time. So changes in appetite, really, really normal. I would say exhaustion and fatigue are huge. Like, people say this all the time, I'm just exhausted. I can hardly get out of bed. And I have no energy. That is really typical. And there's nothing wrong. It's just grief is hard work and your body is worn out. So exhaustion is a huge one. Changes in sleep pattern. And again, some people sleep, they can't sleep. and some people sleep all the time. Some people don't want to sleep because of the dreams and the nightmares that they have. But changes in sleep, very typical physical manifestation of grief. Stomach ache, other GI issues, that is also really normal. It's very normal to have somatic or physical sensations and discomforts around grief. Like I worked with a mom whose daughter had had a respiratory death, and for the first month or so, every day at the time that the daughter died, she would start to feel her throat closing up and just like she couldn't breathe. And that kind of thing is really normal. Of course, you should always get checked out physical symptoms. Like, you wouldn't want to assume, oh, I'm just having physical symptom of grief. My chest is tight. Well, maybe you're having a heart attack. So get it checked out and see your doctor. Make sure that what you're experiencing is indeed nothing that you need to worry about. And but it can really, I think it can really help to know that there are physical signs of grief. It's not just emotional. Anxiety is another one. Oh my gosh. People feel very anxious. They feel panicky. And of course, something awful happened. So people are going to be anxious. Headaches are another one, probably related to changes in appetite and exhaustion, changes in sleep. All of these things are probably really related, but really normal for people to have headaches. And tension, of course, and stress. Crying, lots and lots of crying. When I work with kids, it's really, I had a 9-year-old once say to me, his brother had died, and he said to me, "My parents cry all the time, and it is so annoying." And so I learned pretty quickly that for kids, seeing the grown-ups crying, that was really hard. And so I would tell the kids, all right, your parents and all the grown-ups, they're going to cry. They have to cry like 1 million tears. So there's no sense of stopping it because they're going to cry them. So just hand them a Kleenex. But I think really it helps, again, even for kids, to know, yeah, normal. They just have a certain number of tears they got to cry. Might as well just get it done with. And I feel the same way about us when we're grieving. It's like there's no sense of trying not to cry. The person or the thing that you've lost, they're worth every tear. It's okay. And crying is really, really common sign of grief. And of course, then there are people who don't cry. That's okay. Again, everyone's different and does it in their way. Emotional manifestations of grief. Of course, we're familiar with the sorrow and the despair, but I think the two that I see the most and hear about the most that are most challenging for people are anger and guilt. And anger about everything, you know, that this happened, that I've lost something, that I have to deal with this. And guilt, what could I have done different? Did I stand too close to the microwave? Did I not eat the right food? Didn't take the right vitamins? Sometimes I wonder if we choose to feel guilty because it's easier to like find a reason for something, even if the reason seems kind of wacky, than to say, wow, random bad things can happen at any time to any of us. And I've kind of learned that when people feel guilty, to just maybe let them feel guilty, because maybe it's easier to say to yourself, well, this is my fault. Maybe that's easier than saying, well, wow, bad things really do just happen out of nowhere. So I find guilt and anger to be, they're hard for people to deal with. And you know, I think anger especially, and guilt, is a choice. And I don't think anger is a particularly good choice. I think, of course, we're going to be mad that things happen, but when we hang on to it, my experience is that people who are angry and maintain their anger they have a more difficult time. So anger and guilt, two emotions, really challenging for grief. Very normal, but challenging. Really normal to be frustrated. People that are grieving have a very short fuse. I worked with a mom who told me about how after her son died, she was standing in the post office. It was during the holidays, which would kind of make anybody have a short fuse, but she was grieving, so that was even worse. but somebody was standing behind her talking on the cell phone, and she said to me she just lost it. She's like, she couldn't take one more thing. So she turned around and went postal on this poor woman in the post office. And she felt guilty about it, but she said she just couldn't help herself. And so I sort of imagine this person out there probably still telling the story about how this crazy lady went crazy on her at the post office for talking on the cell phone. That's how grieving people are. They just can't take one more thing. They have no reserves. And so you feel frustrated all the time about everything. Sometimes when somebody dies especially, there can be a sense of relief, which is typically quickly followed by guilt, but relief that someone's not suffering anymore, or, you know, it's done, it's over, whatever it was. And that also can be a challenging one, but that's also typical. Remember, we're complex, so we can feel lots of things all at the same time. And really typical to also feel a sense of just sort of hopelessness, like nothing matters. It's really, we'll talk about that in spiritual too, but that's a really common emotional reaction. Some people don't realize that grief happens in our social lives, in the context of community. And so it's not surprising that you'll see manifestations or symptoms of grief in our social world. These are the ones I've seen the most. A desire to be left alone. Like, I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to have to do anything. I want everyone to leave me alone. Nobody understands. So real changes in relationship. Not wanting to be alone. Sometimes, but not as often. It seems like people can't stand to be alone. But mostly people just really can't deal with other people. And I think that's because, and people have said this to me, normal things and conversations seem meaningless, and they infuriate people. People will say, you know, people are complaining because they lost their keys. Try losing their kid. You know, so the tolerance for what other people consider problems, there is no tolerance. And so grieving people, rather than, you know, hit people all the time for saying such stupid things, and being complaining about things that are unimportant, grieving people will withdraw. It's really common to see grieving people avoid social gatherings for this reason. The ordinary seems so wrong, and so they don't want to be around it. The other thing is that people will talk about how their relationships and friendships change because they see who is their real friend and who is not. You know, some people just cannot deal with someone who is grieving or has lost something significant, including health, and they will withdraw. Not because they don't love the person, but because they themselves just can't deal with it. All right, well, a person who has had a loss has every right to be really upset about that withdrawal, and you'll see friendships end and other ones really deepen. So definitely social manifestations of grief. And this one is another one I think people do not recognize enough. There are cognitive manifestations to grief. That means our thinking is affected. And the things that I have seen most commonly are confusion. People just aren't thinking straight. They just can't process. They have difficulties with memory. So this, when I work with people who are grieving, who have had a big loss or in some kind of crisis, the last thing you want to do is flood them with information, especially verbal information that they're not going to remember. They didn't hear beyond the first sentence when you gave them the bad news. So really normal when you're working with people who are grieving or have had a loss, you have to write everything down. You might have to give them the written information more than once. People that are grieving have impaired decision-making because their thinking just isn't as clear. That is why we recommend that when you have had a big loss, you don't make any big decisions because you're likely to decide something that a year from now you look back and say, oh, what was I thinking? And the answer is kind of you weren't because your brain was filled with all this bad news, all this grief. So, and that's typical, that's common. Very normal to have a sense of disbelief. And what people will say is that they wake up in the morning and for that split second they're all happy again because they didn't remember that the person is gone or that the thing has happened, and then it hits them, and then there they are again, starting all over. And you just can't believe that it could happen. And that's hard, that sense of disbelief. Nightmares and or very vivid dreams, this especially if someone has died, really common for people to talk about. It didn't even feel like a real dream. It felt like the person was visiting me. And it's happened so much that I guess I don't doubt it I don't doubt it. Like, I think it's possible that the person is visiting. The dreams are so vivid, they're so real, and then other people wish that they could have those kind of dreams, and they don't. But for some, the nightmares and very vivid dreams are a big part of grief. And I've talked about this already, that it's really common that grieving people think they are going crazy. And that just hurts me, that someone who already has a broken heart is having to worry about going crazy because they don't understand what normal grief is. And then the lack of motivation. Just, I don't care about anything. I don't want to do anything. Nothing matters anymore. Really typical. After one of my kids got a concussion in a football game, I realized, oh, grief is a lot like a concussion. He behaved a lot like grieving people. With all of these symptoms. So now I think of grief like an emotional concussion. Grief also has spiritual manifestations. And what that looks like is a sense of nothing matters. It's that meaninglessness again, that what's the point? You know, none of this matters. Very typical for there to be changes in religious or spiritual beliefs, and it can go either direction. I've worked with people who will say, oh, I'm not going to church anymore. I've left my religious community because I'm a good person, and why did God let this happen? Or somebody could find their spirituality or religion very, very important to them after a big loss. And that's also typical. So just changes, because it really, when you have a big loss and you're grieving, it really does force you to, or maybe it invites you to sort of think about things beyond the ordinary. And you do confront yourself with those hard questions, which leads to the next one, which is questioning. Very, very common to start doing all that questioning. Why? Why did this happen to me? Why, when I am such a good person, why was it my loved one? Why not somebody who didn't care about their child? Or whoever it is. Lots and lots of questions. And most of the questions actually don't have any answers that we know. People have to find their own. Very common to be angry at God and the universe. I had somebody tell me once that she imagines that after we die, we're going to be in a big long line, and at the end of the line is going to be one of those little booths like they have in the Peanuts cartoons, with above at the top it's going to say answers to the why questions, and there's going to be a big line about that. And I that struck me because it seems so true, you know, that people are angry and that they want answers, and they want to know, what the heck, why is this happening? And if people have a belief in God or a higher power or just the universe, really normal to be angry at whatever that is. So, you know, again, grief, normal grief, does not just mean being sad and crying. It means having our thinking impaired. It means having our spirituality or our religion challenged, emotional. There is the emotional. There's certainly physical symptoms and social. There's lots of social symptoms and social changes that are very normal. And again, I think if we know what's normal, then we're less likely to have that sense of I'm losing my mind. So I want to even more go into what to really expect from grief. Like what should I expect? What's normal? So expect grief to be a process that will last longer than you expect. And even more, it's a process that will last longer than your friends and family think or expect. They're going to think you should be over this. I one time had a grandma call me up and say, "Oh my gosh, it's been 4 months since her baby died. Why won't she move on?" 4 months. That 4 or 5, 3 months is a kind of it's a time when you hit a bit of a dip, first of all. But also, 4 months is nothing when you've lost something that you really care about. So grief is going to last longer. How long is it going to last? Well, I would say getting through the first year after something big happens is particularly difficult. And depending on how bad it is, it could be another year or 2 or 3 or longer after that. Is it going to get gradually better? Yes, of course it will. But it's not going to be better after 4 months or even 6 months. It's going to be a process. And I think part of that, why that is because it takes a while before you really understand all the implications of your loss. And when you do, you grieve those as well. So grief is ongoing. It's not just, oh, I'm grieving the loss of this person. It's like, oh no, now I'm grieving the loss of the fact that that person's not here for Christmas or Hanukkah, or that person is not here for my wedding or my graduation. Those are losses as well that get grieved. We should expect from grief intense and changing emotions. Like I described with the woman in the post office, really big emotions, and they change on a dime. Everything could be seeming to go great, and then a song comes on the radio or something flashes through your head or you smell something and you're a puddle. You're just sobbing again. And that's normal. It's not a sign of craziness. Expect to feel physical effects of grief, including fatigue. Of course, talked about that. And that lasts for a while as well. I tell people in the first 4 to 6 weeks after a big loss, if you're getting up and taking a shower, yay, that's kind of big. And if it's only once a week, well, that's understandable. So it's hard, very hard, and you will absolutely have physical effects. Expect that you won't feel like yourself for a long time. And maybe I would even say that you're not going to be yourself. Again, you're going to have a new normal. You'll be transformed. Grief transforms us. And so it takes a while before we get to a point where we find our new self. And you feel like, I don't feel like myself. And that lasts for a long time. Expect to feel afraid that more terrible things will happen in your life. And this kind of goes along with what I said about the guilt, is that when you have something bad happen, not only has the bad thing happened, but you've had some of your illusions shattered. You can't pretend anymore that people don't get bad diseases or have bad things happen. They do happen. And so now that you know that, kind of look around and say, what's next? Is lightning going to hit me? So really normal to have that. And that's part of the anxiety, oh my gosh, something else is, what else? What's next? And that's normal. Expect to feel as if nothing is important anymore. Again, that's normal. Will it last forever? Of course not. You will feel like things matter again. But it's very normal that you feel right now that they're not if you've just had a big loss. Expect that everyday conversations will seem meaningless to you and, in fact, may make you angry. I think that's really important for people that are grieving to understand, is that it's normal that they're not going to want to have the same kind of conversations anymore, and that's going to make them really mad that people are talking about things like their new carpet, or they're mad because their child won't take a shower. I worked with I had a student once who came to me to complain that, what do I do about my 9-year-old? He won't take showers in the morning. And less than a month later, that child was dead. And I've always remembered that, and I've always thought, well, I bet she wishes she had that dirty 9-year-old back, right? Because now when something like that happens, you're you're thinking, why was I complaining about showers? You know, and when you're grieving, you have that acute awareness that, you know, shouldn't be complaining about showers. There are way worse problems of whether or not your kid takes a shower or not. Expect to feel crazy at times. And then expect to feel like there could not possibly be better days ahead. And I guess what I really want to say is that there are. I worked for a long time with parents who lost their children, and what was so helpful about the fact that I did it for a long time was that if I would have stopped after just a year or two, I wouldn't have known that people can and do recover from really awful things. And not only can they recover, but they're transformed, and in good ways. So my experiences have given me this sense of hope. Someone asked me recently, how can you do grief things all the time? Isn't it so depressing? It's like, yes, it's very sad. I mean, I don't wish bad things on anyone. But when they do happen, I also have that awareness that they can be okay again and that they will be. So even though people feel like it's never going to be better, I'm going to feel like this forever, that actually is not true. One of the things you can count on in life is that things are going to change, and it does get better. Expect that people will not know what to say and that some will say really stupid things. It's best to try to avoid hitting people when they say stupid things. That just compounds your problems. But it's really true. People don't know what to say, and so they say things like, oh, God won't give you any bigger burden than you can bear. And if it's a death, they'll say, well, at least she's not suffering. At least it's in a better place. And, you know, those things they mean well. They're well-intentioned, and that's the way to handle when people say things that are unfortunate, is that to focus on the intention. They mean well. You might not appreciate the words and the content, but the intentions are positive. Expect that you will find things that make you smile again, and that's something I like to don't necessarily want to tell people, you know, this will get better, you just got to give it time. Well, life doesn't have a fast forward button, so people don't necessarily want to hear that. But I think when we're working with people that are grieving, or if we're grieving and we can tell ourselves that, it can help, is that this is temporary. I will be okay again. Tomorrow, what we're going to do is talk about very specific things that we can do to help ourselves and others cope with grief, especially when we've had a devastating diagnosis, life-changing diagnosis. Today it was really important for me to lay out what does normal grief look like, because my experience is that the best intervention, the one that seems to impact people the most, is just knowing what is normal. I've had so many people tell me that, oh, well, okay, if I know it's normal and I know it's grief and it's temporary, I can deal with it. So I wanted to spend the time talking about that today, that grief is not linear, grief does not have stages, it's very chaotic. That's very normal. Everybody grieves in different ways, but there are manifestations of grief that are pretty typical, and I think it's helpful to know that, and I think it's helpful just to know what to expect from grief. We can handle things so much better if we're prepared. And so that's what I wanted to do today, and I hope that we were able to do that. And then tomorrow when we talk, we'll talk about, okay, it's normal grief. Great. Now what? And now I invite your questions.
Well, Dr. Bowman, this has clarified so much, and I think if one had a checklist, one could tick off every question that has been sent in. That was so much. However, there were a couple things that people needed clarification about. And
Okay.
And one of them is the concept of euphoric recall about the person you've lost.
Uh-huh.
Could you explain that for us?
So when you say euphoric recall, would you mean thinking, you think back on that person. I've heard that term used different ways, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you mean.
Well, as I understand it, it is euphoric recall that you've recently lost your mother. She could do no wrong. She could do.
Oh, right.
She was absolutely angelic and perfect, and never said a mean thing to you in all
Ever.
together ever.
Yes, and that is what I usually think of when I think of that term, is that it's I call it revisionist history. So I think it's really common. I mean, and I am like I should go, like some people are wedding planners, I should be a funeral planner, because I've been to so many funerals, and you never hear anyone get up at a funeral and say, well, my dad was actually a bit of a racist jerk, and he did have a tendency to hit us once in a while when he was drunk, but he had many fine qualities. Oh no, we never hear the bad things. We only hear all these good things, and you're sitting there wondering, wow, how come everybody I know has kind of tendencies towards imperfection, but this person was perfect? I think we do that. I think we do that because, you know, I mean, we even have sayings about you shouldn't speak ill of the dead, and I think it's really typical, and especially right after the person dies. I think we do that, and then over time, you start to see that, oh yeah, they weren't perfect, and you incorporate that. And I think it's best if you're working with someone and they're doing that to just let them have that sense. It's like, it's okay if they want to say that the Aunt Jane was perfect. You know, no need to bring up all of Aunt Jane's perfections. That's fine. But I worry about it in a way for a couple reasons. A lot of my experience is working with families. So if the parents have had a child die and they have 2 surviving children, the child that died takes on these just perfect qualities. Like, they can't think of anything the child ever did wrong. And there are these 2 living imperfect children who have to grow up in the shadow of basically an angel. And that can be really hard. So I think we should be mindful that we're doing that when it could impact other people, especially kids. And then the other thing is that I think when we forget that a person was imperfect, it can add to our own guilt, because we can think of all the mean things that we ever did or said, and we then compare ourselves to the person who died, and I think that can increase our guilt. I think it's way better to just sort of say to ourselves and others, is my mom was a great person. She wasn't perfect, but, you know, I'm not going to dwell on that. I loved her, she loved me, and she was a human being just like I am. But very typical, I think, for all of us to do that. Just something to be careful about when you've got kids involved.
That's a very good point. As a follow-up to euphoric recall, there doesn't seem to be any midpoint between recalling your mother as the perfect angelic being and then realizing that sometimes she was really mean.
Right.
And subsequently, would that then go into anger reactions?
Yeah, I think, yes, anger, and that's really black and white thinking, and we can work on our own cognitive, we can restructure our thinking. So when we find ourselves in black and white thinking about anything, we should always stop ourselves and say, whoa, I am engaging in black and white thinking. Nothing in life is either or. It's always somewhere in the middle. And I think it can help if we're doing that to remember that. It's like, wait a minute, now I'm focusing on everything bad my mom ever did, and I'm, of course, feeling mad. Where's the middle road? I think that's really important. And I want to say that euphoric recall is not just about death, but we have a tendency to do this about life. So if we get a diagnosis, we tend to look back and it's like, oh, in my, before the diagnosis, my life was perfect. I was running marathons. My life was just like amazing. And, nobody's life is really always perfect, right? So I do think we have a tendency to do that. Or oh, when I was on vacation, it was just so, it was idyllic and it was just so perfect. And so I don't think we just do euphoric recall when someone dies. I think we do it about our past in general. We do it about our history as a nation. I mean, it's not, it's not, it must be some normal human thing we do if we all do it. Don't you think?
Oh, well, I certainly do.
Yeah.
We had someone write in about a month ago and saying that when, in fact, their child who had NF died, the only thing that they could, the only way they could consider coping is to think about suicide.
Yeah.
And this, I'm wondering if that is an extreme reaction. Now, it has been a couple months and that person is still with us, but is that, I'm asking you, but is that one of those additional coping mechanisms to have yet another option?
Well, I had an email support group for bereaved parents, and it's interesting that you asked me that question, because one of the most memorable things from that group experience was a mom. I was seeing her individually as well, and then she was in the email support group with the other moms who had lost children, and she called it the Sad Mothers Group, but she came to me maybe 2 or 3 weeks after her child died, and she told me, you know, that group is really helpful, because even though it's really sad, if I realized by watching all those, you know, these moms have had their kids die a year or two ago, it must get better, because if it didn't, they would all kill themselves. That's what she said, that if it didn't get better, no one could endure this pain, so they would kill themselves. So she said it was very helpful for her to realize, oh, it must get better. I mean, it was sort of an odd way to assess that, oh, it gets better because they're all still alive, so I guess I'm going to get better too, and I should hang in there. But it worked for her. And it does remind me that when we are in a lot of pain, emotional pain or physical pain, we want to escape. And so when someone says something like that, first of all, you always should assess their level of seriousness. You should never just assume, oh, they're just talking. But a lot of times it really is an expression of pain. It's like, it's not so much that people want to die as it's they don't want the pain. They don't want to keep going without that person. It hurts so bad, they want it to stop. That's different than I want to be dead. And it's important to assess which of those things it is, but it is a typical reaction to grief, to have that sense of, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to live without this person that I've lost, or I don't want to live with this new disability I have to deal with. So it's typical. It should always be considered seriously, of course. But I've heard it so many times, and one of the things that helps people, like I said with this woman who gave us the example, is to know that it does get better. It doesn't stay that awful forever. It does get better, and you just got to keep marching through that really acutely painful parts and get support, whatever it takes, so that you can do it and get to calmer waters. But yes, not extreme. I would not call that extreme, especially when you're talking about the death of a child.
Well, that's very helpful. To end, Dr. Bowman, would you mind, before my closing remarks, would you mind giving us a I found it very comforting, your frame example to leave us.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and that was, you know, sometimes I think I don't necessarily have a lot of great ideas, but once in a while one hits me. And that one it resonated with me, and it's helped explain grief to a lot of people. And the way that it works is, if you can imagine the picture frame of your life, like in your picture frame are all the things that make up your life, And everyone's different. So for me, it might be my work, my family, my garden, my dogs, my life, every little thing that's part of my life. And when you have a big loss, nothing else fits anymore. It's just grief. The picture frame is filled with grief. All the edges are covered in dark, and grief just covers everything. There's no room. There's no space in the picture frame anymore. And with time, what you find is that gradually there's space again in the picture frame of your life. That it happens little by little, but then this corner becomes available and you can find yourself going on a hike, and now this corner is available and you can smile about something fun that your child did. And suddenly, at some point, you realize, wow, I am not completely filled up with grief anymore. It never goes away all the way. It always stays. But I don't think that's wrong. Like, if you have a big wound, you have a scar, and it reminds you of the big wound. But it also reminds you of the love that you had for that person or whatever it is that's lost. So it makes sense that it stays. It's always a part of you. But there is space again in your life, in your heart, in your mind for other things. And it absolutely happens. It's not like the grief stays front and center forever. It's just there for a time. It's a testimony to how much you loved and how much you've lost, and it's appropriate, but it's also temporary.
That's a beautiful, beautiful metaphor, and thank you so much for ending this part one session with that. I'm sure all of us presently and in the future who will listen to this want to thank you, Dr. Marianne Bowman, for this beautiful presentation. We also want to thank our listeners for joining us. Within the next week, I will be sending a link to this complete session in the email that you provided so that you may view it again or share it with your loved ones if you wish. We'll also try to check in with you via our website, www.nfmidatlantic.org, as well as email blasts. We will follow up with any resources that you might find helpful during this process, and those will also be on our website. A reminder that the session that Dr. Bowman spoke of tomorrow, part 2 of Coping with Grief, is When an Incurable Disorder Affects Daily Living, for patients and caregivers. And you may sign up for that at any time prior to tomorrow. NF Mid-Atlantic also provides free communication with patient support advocates. For those of you who have people who share the diagnosis, those are people who share the diagnosis and are available to share feelings and thoughts and questions. We don't give medical advice, but they serve as sympathetic ears if you feel you need that. And please feel free to contact me about that service. Our next webinar after tomorrow's webinar will be on October 3rd, 2013, and appropriately enough, as Dr. Bowman alluded to in her example of when you have other children in the family who are still alive and thriving. Our next webinar on October 3rd will be how illness and/or disability in a family affects marital or family relationships. You'll get a registration link via email. Thank you again for your participation, and a final wonderful thank you to Dr. Marianne Bowman. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.